Chapter 2. Just the basic facts. Can you show me where it hurts? Mass doesn't start for another hour, mother, Sirius argued, slipping his pair of comically oversized sunglasses onto his nose to cover his black eye, which, as of this morning, had started to turn a nauseating kaleidoscope of yellow and green. Not to mention the dark circles under his eyes, which almost made it look like he'd been given two separate black eyes on two different occasions. But it was mostly from lack of sleep. He drifted off sometime after midnight, likely just before James and Lily got home and started on their baby-making conquest, and had to leave at 5 a.m., before James was up, so Sirius didn't get the details on whether or not James had the stamina to make a second attempt, to make it to Mass on time. Well, technically, he was telling his mother the truth. He was just an hour early. "I'll meet you at the church," Sirius sighed, trying to wrap up this conversation. However, when his mother continued to argue with him, he disconnected the call. He thought about shutting it off altogether, but the thought of getting a potential text from Mooney prevented him from doing it. In his Hollyhead t-shirt, Sirius stepped into the same church he'd passed the day before, pausing for a moment to listen for that characteristic sound, despite the fact that there was now quite a few people in the pews, waiting for the start of the service. There was no sound, not even a hum. But the sound of that tune, specifically in a whistle, had driven him mad in his sleep. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was there a clergyman somewhere in this church who knew, by heart, a song about rock and roll and illegal substance abuse? It was making him insane with wonder. Not to mention, he thought it might be too early to text Mooney, so he didn't have his favorite distraction. That's not to say he hadn't opened the conversation a half dozen times since dawn and considered sending a message anyway. But he also wasn't sure how to reinitiate the conversation. As he walked further into the building, ears open, he snarled a bit at the parishioners who were gawking at him, clutching their pearls at his blatant sacrilegious t-shirt, at his long, dark hair tied haphazardly into messy bun on the top of his head, at his ripped black jeans that were very well fitted to his thighs, but not so well fitted to his hips. It likely didn't help his image that he was tracking dried mud all over the carpet from where it had been caked onto his beaten leather combat boots from his walk home from the pub the night before. And these religious sons of bitches probably didn't look too kindly on the characteristic imprints of the pack of cigarettes in his back pocket either. Not to mention the obvious head wound being not so subtly hidden behind ridiculously oversized sunglasses. Whatever sneer he got, he gave one in return. One elderly woman literally made the sign of the cross in his direction. Still, he wasn't sure what he expected. Not from the parishioners, of course. He'd spent enough time with his mother to expect this sort of reception towards his ungodly appearance. No, what he wasn't sure about was why he was going through this extra effort to find his mysterious whistler from the day before. Obviously, whoever it was wasn't whistling now, but why would they be? It was Sunday morning. Mass would start in an hour, and the church was already full of people. Nobody sane would be whistling. It didn't mean he wasn't a little bit disappointed. With a disgruntled huff that was loud enough to startle that one elderly lady into signing the cross again, Sirius turned around from where he'd made it all the way across the nave. Towards the back of the church was a doorway, and when he passed it, he didn't hear music. Leaning through the door, it was clearer. He heard someone yelling, someone cursing. Quickly, he slipped through the swinging doors, down a hallway. At the end of the hallway was a split, a fork. One side went out towards the back garden, which Sirius could see through a small window in the center of the hallway, and the other led to a set of stairs that descended into the basement. At first, he moved towards the stairs, hearing the faintest of music, but he was unable to make it out, mostly because the yelling had resumed, and the cursing had intensified. It was coming from outside. "You furry, rotten bastard. Get your garden-munching arse back here so I can feed you to the fucking badgers." As Sirius peeked through the window, he could see a man in all black waving his arms in what looked like an absolute fury, something resembling a half-eaten strawberry in one hand and a fistful of chewed leaves in the other, stomping heavily through the rows between his crops with his head down. Curious and amused, Sirius opened the back door without drawing the attention of the violent gardener. As he leaned casually against the wood grain, he spoke. That was you yesterday, wasn't it? In his surprise, the man in the garden let out a mumbled shout, throwing green, leafy vegetables into the air above his head. As he looked back to the source of the sudden sound, the greens rained down over him, getting caught in the thick, curly hair that was now obscuring most of his face in its darkness. The dimly lit end of a cigarette splitting the dark curtain of his hair to one side. In the stillness, the ash of that cigarette glowed with renewed embers as the man took in an apparently sharpened breath. When he pushed his fingers through his hair to move it from his face, all arrogance that Sirius felt in his chest evaporated. Within golden eyes behind large, round, gold frames, the man's expression was dazed, struck, the cigarette hanging forgotten from one corner of his mouth as he watched Sirius with panic, as if Sirius could surge forward to throttle him at any given moment. There was a sudden, nervous clench in his jaw underneath the dark stubble on his copper skin that was peppered with frequent grays, and the movement violently clamped down the end of the cigarette still between his teeth. With his fingers holding the unruly hair from his face, hair that was flecked with gray, just like the stubble on his face, he swallowed heavily, and Sirius watched the movement of his throat, under his fitted clerical collar. Sirius repeated his inquiry anyways, despite the sudden pounding of his heart, and he wasn't sure if it was pounding because of how unexpectedly handsome this bloke was, or if he was suddenly transported back to the terror of Catholic primary school and having a priest as his headmaster. "It was you, wasn't it?" he said, perplexed by the panic in the man's expression. "Pink Floyd, Comfortably Numb. You were whistling it in the church yesterday, weren't you?" The reaction he received was peculiar. His shoulders slumped forward entirely, deflated from their rigid state of shock and horror, with a large exhale that sounded a lot like a sigh of relief. "Yeah," he said, half of a laugh as he slipped the spent cigarette from his lips and lifted his foot so he could stub it out on the heel of his boot. "That was me." "Don't worry, Father. Your secret is safe with me," Sirius replied with a wink. He expected a smile in return, or, at the very least, a nod of agreement. Instead, the priest began to laugh. And it wasn't a polite chuckle or an obligatory snort of amusement. He doubled over in laughter, holding his ribs. At first, it looked like he was going to reply, but he stopped himself, pursing his lips over tightly clenched teeth, which Sirius could appreciate from the flex of his tightened jaw. Just underneath the bright silver patch at his left temple, tucked within his dark hair. In fact, Sirius lowered his sunglasses to appreciate the sight much further, but as soon as the priest saw the black eye that Sirius had been hiding under those ridiculously broad frames, his eyes widened, but only slightly. It looked less like an expression of surprise, and more like he'd come to an important realization, especially in the sudden way his whole face fell out of amusement, in the way he pulled in a sharp, steadying breath through both nostrils. That expression only lasted for a moment before he let his head drop forward, pulling a tight wince, as if berating himself silently for something. And Sirius couldn't help but liken it to the way James's face looked when he accidentally brought up something related to Regulus. Shifting his brow into a furrow of concern, he stepped forward, leaning in, the long sleeves of his black shirt lifting up over his bony wrists a little as he reached forward, sliding the sunglasses up into Sirius's hair. Sirius went still. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize," the priest said, his eyes scattering over Sirius's face, and Sirius could hear the most subtle hint of an accent in his voice that he couldn't quite place. "Teddy didn't tell me he was sending you." He sighed, voice hushed and gaze focused as he took Sirius's chin between his fingers, turning Sirius's face to get a better look at the wound, all the while rapid-firing strange questions in Sirius's direction. "Do you have somewhere you can stay? Have you eaten today? Do you want me to file a report?" he asked, pushing Sirius's glasses back down to recover the out-of-place color on Sirius's pale skin, apparently oblivious to the pounding of Sirius's heart in his chest, and the pulsing of the veins in his throat, and the heated blush that Sirius could feel spreading out over his cheeks like sacramental wine. "Who the fuck is Teddy?" Sirius asked, still wide-eyed. "And, I mean, I'm a bit peckish, I suppose, but I had a cup of coffee on my drive in this morning, so I'm not starving to death or anything." The priest blinked silently at him, a flush of color across his golden cheeks. "How old are you?" 31. in exactly the same manner as before, but with a wildly different expression on his face. He let out a heavy sigh through his nostrils and let his head fall forward. This time, his head fell into his open palm with a soft smacking sound, nearly dislodging the wide, round glasses from his nose. Christ, you're as old as I am, he grumbled for a moment before lifting his head and throwing on a congenial smile, trying to tuck his unruly hair behind both ears, still pink with blush, though his hair wasn't quite long enough, or thin enough, to stay put. I'm sorry, you look a bit younger than you are. How old do I look? Sirius asked, somewhat amused, trying to sound playfully offended. With a curious smirk, the priest answered, Well, you're obviously not 17. And Sirius found himself laughing about how he and Mooney had just had this conversation. But you don't really look your age. He gave Sirius a look. You definitely don't look old enough to have a mortgage. My mortgage is paid off, thank you very much, Sirius quipped, paying attention to the way this priest was suddenly avoiding eye contact. Are you disappointed? That I'm not 17, I mean? The flush returned, and the priest tried to recover. No, not at all. I thought you were one of the... He stopped with a click of his tongue, as if trying to decide what to say. See, there's this, service. God, that's not the right word at all. A charity that I provide, I guess you could say. Enjoying the deep red color he was able to elicit from underneath this bloke's handsome chestnut skin, Sirius's arrogance returned with a fury. Is this some sort of priest-age kink situation? But the blush didn't return to his new friend's face. Instead, he covered his expression in blatant disgust and simply responded with, Don't be gross. And Sirius smiled a little at how Mooney had also said just that same thing to him the night before. No, Teddy is a kid in the neighborhood who keeps an eye on the other other kids, and sometimes adults, he said, pausing as he looked over at Sirius, as if not wanting to insinuate that Sirius had looked like a child at 31 years. He sends the ones in real trouble to me to help sort it out. As he spoke, he gathered the baskets of fruit and vegetables he'd already collected, before Sirius surprised him, and he'd thrown the rest into the air. Trouble like a black eye from Dearest Dad? Sirius asked with an understanding nod, knowing the thing that this priest was trying to avoid admitting out loud to a perfect stranger. For lifestyle choices? With a quick glance at Sirius's face, the priest let out a knowing sigh. Yeah. Well, if it makes you feel better, I did get this black eye from my dad, Sirius said with a wide grin to offset the sickliness of his black eye as he pushed his sunglasses up into his hair. But this time, it actually had nothing to do with the fact that I'm gay. With baskets in both arms, the priest moved towards the door, shooting a blatantly worried expression in Sirius's direction as he passed. Quickly, Sirius moved ahead of him and opened the door back into the church, eliciting a small smile, a quiet thank you. This time? He asked as Sirius followed him through the hallways of the church and into a bigger-than-expected kitchen. He wasn't able to see the concern he thought might have been on his face. It's fine. It's the last time it'll ever happen anyway. He shrugged, moving back to a more pressing topic. Couldn't that make some trouble for you, though? A priest taking in stray kids? A look crossed over his face, like he was irritated by that statement. Isn't that fucked up? That there are so many pedophiles in the Catholic Church that I can't take care of the children in my own congregation without making sure there are 3 other people in the room with me to witness the fact that I genuinely give a shit about the well-being of these kids? He asked, bitterness in his tone and in the bite of his words, but with a heavy sigh, he cast Sirius a glance of apology. Sorry, that's a touchy subject for me. He laughed a bit before adding, I have some friends to help me with that. Very qualified friends, by the way. One of them is a nun. The other is a child counselor, who... Sirius interrupted, holding his hands up in the air as a sign of surrender, realizing his error in bringing up this topic. Fuck, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply... But the priest just smiled easily. It's fine. You wouldn't be the first to make the wrong assumptions, he said, the easy smile on his face drifting into something strained and tired. I wouldn't do it if these kids didn't need someone to look out for them. He paused to let out a weighted sigh. From what I've seen, they need that. Before he could stop himself, Sirius let out a sigh to match, feeling a bit of that bitterness in his chest, wishing he'd had someone like this kind priest to turn to when he was younger. If their childhood is anything like mine was, then they're lucky you're here. Before the priest could comment on that alarming implication, Sirius swiftly spoke again. Speaking of which, since this charity you provide is for the queer kids, did you just assume I'm gay because of the... His thoughts trailed off as the priest turned around to watch him gesture to the whole left side of his face, answering before Sirius could continue. It's not just for queer kids, he half argued, but it dissolved as Sirius gave him a look. Okay, fine. It's mostly for the queer kids, but they're the ones usually in trouble, and... He glanced at Sirius again, sort of quickly and a little bit sternly under a raised brow that should have reminded Sirius of his time in Catholic school, but definitely didn't. And yes, I just assumed. When Sirius didn't argue, the priest began separating his produce, storing some of it in the refrigerator, for others, making space on the counter. And now, since I know you're so fucking ancient, I'm trying to figure out why you're here. Amused by his casual swearing, Sirius laughed. Jesus, do all priests have a mouth like you? With that brow still raised, and that curious smirk still on the corner of his lips, and a darkness to his golden eyes that hadn't been there before, he turned to Sirius only to say, Nobody has a mouth like me. In an instant, Sirius was crimson from head to toe, blood moving faster under his skin than he thought was physically possible. Strange that two separate people could give him the same violent rush, remembering the way "I'm flirting with you" looked on the screen of his mobile lit up in the dark last night. Obviously noticing the furious flush under Sirius's skin, the priest's mouth fell open in his surprise, and he backpedaled immediately. Oh, God, I'm so sorry. I absolutely meant the swearing. I should have said nobody swears like me, he said, craning his neck as he loosened his collar, but he quickly pulled his hand down when he noticed the rapid draw of Sirius's attention to the skin underneath that collar. I don't know, Father. I feel like maybe you were coming on to me, Sirius teased, smirking. No! He nearly shouted, moving to hold his hands out in front of him, but curling them into fists and pulling them back to his chest, though that anxiously began working up to his neck and over his face, fretfully adjusting his glasses. Certainly not, he said, increasing the formality of his speech, as if in some effort to make himself seem proper again. I am ordained, which means that I'm... Oh, so the celibacy thing is true then? Sirius continued his ruthless harassment, leaning over the island countertop in the center of the kitchen that separated the two of them. The priest shot him a look of narrowed eyes and pursed his lips as he realized Sirius was having a laugh at his expense. It is. He turned back towards the refrigerator. Stop fetishizing my profession. I'm not fetishizing your entire profession, just the one professional in it. Sirius grinned, leaning down to place his face in his hands, propped up with his elbows on the countertop. Besides, I'm not the one who started the innuendo, and I'm certainly not the one looking that good in a clerical collar. At first, the priest turned, raised a finger as if to argue, but when he realized Sirius had said he looked good, he snapped his mouth shut rather quickly, ears spiking pink again. Is there something you needed from me specifically, or can I direct you to literally anyone else in this church instead? You're just flustered because you got caught flirting with me, Sirius smiled politely. I was not, he began to argue, loudly, before stopping to take a breath. Listen, you're not the first person to have the priest fantasy, okay? So, if you're just here to ogle me while I do my job... I'm not here to ogle you, Sirius said, holding his hands in the air, remembering the way Mooney had done it in that break in the Bayside cover the night before. I was here to find out who would have the audacity to whistle one of my favorite heathen songs in their place of worship, and now I feel just awful for making you feel so objectified, so I think maybe a confession will clear my conscience. Fantastic. There's another priest in the confessional booth right now, he said, narrowing his eyes in Sirius's direction as he absently rolled a small blueberry between his fingers. That's funny, Sirius said with a hum, noticing that when he smiled, the priest naturally smiled in return. I just spoke to a lovely member of your congregation who said you were the only one here. With a sly smile, the priest swore again. Shit. And that was an absolute bluff, which you totally fell for, so now I know you were also bluffing. Shit, the priest repeated, this time with a laugh. You slick bastard. So, do I confess all my hedonistic ways here in the kitchen, or does it have to be in your funny little booth? Sirius asked smoothly. Either way, you already know it's me. There was a curious expression on the priest's face, like he was trying to uncover Sirius's motivation by sight alone. You say that, but I have no idea who you are. With a funny grin, he spoke slowly, methodically, watching Sirius in a way that seemed to imply that maybe that statement wasn't totally true. It made Sirius realize that this priest could probably clock him as being an obvious member of the Black family. I'm serious. I'm sure you know my parents, and I sincerely apologize for that, because they're really just the worst. It's Black, by the way. Sirius Black. As in Walburga and... The father interrupted. Orion, he said, under a long outward breath, screwing his eyes closed, as if he had just made an important realization. But his expression moved back into playful rather than quickly. Shame I can't take your confession. It's a conflict of interest. I'm the one delivering your father's eulogy on Friday afternoon. Sirius huffed. He's dead. What's he gonna care? At first, the priest opened his mouth to speak, but a look crossed over his face, and he shut it again, glancing toward Sirius with caution. Wait, didn't you say a moment ago that your dad is the one who hit you? With lips pressed tightly together, Sirius nodded. How in God's name did your dead father give you a black eye? Sirius grinned widely, but it was forced. The fact that he could recognize that it was forced made him even more angry. The priest's concern only deepened, and Sirius wasn't sure if it was because he could see the slip in Sirius's masked bravado, or because he was worried he'd been flirting with a murderer all this time. Don't get excited, Father. It was a heart attack. Sirius sighed. I might have helped it along by adding the necessary stress-induced catalyst, but it was probably the beluga caviar and the foie gras. He punched you in the face and then immediately died of a heart attack? The priest asked, blatantly trying to stifle a laugh, gauging Sirius's face. I take it you and your father weren't all that close. I'm glad the sorry bastard is dead, Sirius replied, and this time the smile was genuine. This might fall within the realm of that conflict of interest I was talking about earlier, but... He leaned in, over the island countertop, to finish with a loose, I'm siding with you, and karma on this one. My God, Father, Sirius gasped, dramatically draping his hand over his chest like a woman in the American South who just overheard the most scandalous gossip. And while he pretended not to notice the slight rise in the priest's brow, he felt a strange acidity move through his throat. Hang on, can I not call you Father? Clearly, I have daddy issues, and it's starting to make me want to vomit a little. With a suspicious smirk, the priest replied, Everyone calls me Father Lupin, and if you're trying to get at my first name, you can keep trying. Sirius snarled, teeth bared. The priest glanced down at the movement of Sirius's lips, and Sirius noticed, this time, he wasn't quick enough to overcorrect his gaze. Fine, I'll make you a deal, Sirius countered, shifting slightly to the edge of the countertop, a little closer to the man in the collar. Father Lupin didn't adjust to widen the distance. I'll just call you any first name I can think of on the spot, but if I get it right, you have to tell me that I guessed it. His golden eyes narrowed in Sirius's direction again. This feels a little too Rumpelstiltskin. Come on, it'll be fun, Sirius spoke in a playful growl. That left eyebrow rose again, and it felt like every time Sirius watched it rise, he found something else to appreciate about it. The scar that broke it into two separate halves, as if it had once been unskillfully pierced. the rogue gray peppering the otherwise dark, their thickness and unruliness making the man look like a little less tame. You can't just hang out in the church all the time. Don't you have a job or something? I'm off all week for the funeral, Sirius said with a tight expression. Right. Sorry, Father Lupin replied, instantly apologetic. Without quite remembering who it was he was speaking to, Sirius reached over and brushed his fingertips against the edge of the father's sleeve, where it was fitted against his wrist. Quickly, Lupin looked up, but his expression didn't give Sirius the reminder of his place the way he expected it would. Instead, it made Sirius forget his place entirely. I thought you were on my side, Sirius joked, letting his hand fall naturally away. And I'm glad he's dead, so don't apologize. Better yet, figure out a way to work it into your eulogy. The priest let a quiet laugh move from his lips, and the smile it left in its shadow had Sirius mirroring it unintentionally. Considering all I've got so far is, we are here today to honor the life of Orion Black, I could probably use the material. He sighed, moving his arm up to run his fingers through his already mussed hair, coming away with another twig he uncovered within it. Of course, Sirius barely noticed the flora because he was too preoccupied with the unforgiving pull of the fabric that tightened around the priest's shoulder as he stretched and the way he leaned into his hand as it rolled down the back of his neck. In a dangerous combination of attraction and boredom, Sirius made a very stupid offer. It's your lucky day, Benny. He paused to address the confusion in the priest's expression. I said I was going to call you by different first names. We're starting now. Surprisingly, Father Lupin nodded in full, but playful, agreement, reminded of the deal that he technically hadn't ever made. I've got a bit of writing experience and a journalism degree, so you can put me right to work. Journalism, huh? Father Lupin asked, eyebrows high. What kind of journalism? I don't write gossip for the Sun, if that's what you're implying with that look, Father, Sirius huffed, secretly admiring the sharp rise of that unruly brow. I'm the editor for a music magazine. Which one? Anything I've heard of? He asked, seeming suddenly and genuinely interested. Called Something Wicked. Mostly album reviews and... The Father Lupin interrupted. Well, it wasn't so much an interruption as it was total, uncontrolled laughter. Head rolling back and everything. If you're trying to tell me you're the editor-in-chief of Something Wicked, he said, still having quite a laugh, brows high on his forehead, hand on his ribs, then that is absolute and utter bullshit. Sirius grinned arrogantly. So you're familiar with my little publication? Familiar enough to know that the founder is the current editor-in-chief, Father Lupin argued, moving around the island so that he could scornfully lean with one hip against the rounded edge. And not so clueless as to believe the founder of the biggest music magazine since Alternative Press is hanging out in my church and making wildly inappropriate sexual advances towards me. He rose a brow. Well, Oliver, I was going to help you write a passable eulogy for that garbage bin of a person, but if you think you can handle it on your own... He trailed off, blinking innocently in the father's direction. With a sigh, he let his head fall forward. Fine. Editor or not, you knew him better than I did. If you think you can twist my words to make him sound like something close to a decent human being. Aw, so you do remember him, Sirius cooed, earning a sheepish wince from Father Lupin. Then I'll take whatever help I can get. And no, it's not Oliver. Or Benny? Or Benny. Unless Sirius was mistaken, there was a fond smirk tucked away underneath the dark salt and pepper stubble on Father Lupin's striking jawline. But it dissolved quickly as he looked down at his watch, partially shifted underneath the edge of his long sleeve. Shit, he hissed under his breath, moving back towards the door that led into the same hallway they'd come in through. In 2 steps, he was instantly out of reach, his long stride accommodated easily by lanky limbs. I say Mass in 10 minutes. I know. I'm supposed to be attending Mass in 10 minutes. Sirius grinned, and he may have let himself enjoy the surprise of watching Lupin smile back in that curiously familiar way. Meet me in the garden afterward. We can start working on the eulogy then. After a subtle pull of his bottom lip into his teeth, in a way that somehow made it look like was completely without intention, Sirius replied, "It's a date." He watched Father Lupin's ears go pink again. Sirius walked back into the nave to find the pews now packed, noticing that his mother and cousins were filling the third row on the right, and that his mother was specifically leaving an empty space for him, likely so she could berate him later in the day for not being in attendance. Still, he was surprised they weren't in the absolute front row, as he knew she liked to maintain her holier-than-thou status. Just before he moved along the wall to unpleasantly surprise his mother, his mobile vibrated in his pocket, an immediate misfire in the previously steady beat of his calm heart. As he unlocked the phone, that picture of Crookshanks bringing a beaming smile to his face, he took a preparatory breath. "Mooney, did the trained assassins murder you last night, or do I get to flirt with you some more?" Leaning against the outer wall of the church, Sirius squeezed his eyes closed and pulled his tightly pursed lips into his teeth to keep from letting out an indelicate and uncivilized whimper. A quick glance to the pulpit assured him that the services hadn't begun yet, so he took the time to respond to the text. "Padfoot, I know how unfair that statement is, since we're just flirting into the void, and I can't actually date you." Mooney, "It's very unfair, I know. We can stop flirting if it's too unfair." Padfoot, "Damn it, you cornered me. You made me admit this. This is your fault. I like the flirting." Mooney, "Shit. Wait, no, I totally mean that. Shit. I'm making this so much worse." Padfoot, "Listen, I don't care, honestly. I want to keep flirting. I don't get the no dating thing, but I also don't give a fuck. I'm having fun with you, Mooney. You know, from a distance." Mooney, "I'm having fun with you too, Padfoot. But believe me when I say, I wish you could have fun with me up close. There are a lot of things I'd like to do to you up close." Padfoot, "Okay, so there's the flirting. And there's a brazen come on. Like, god damn it, Mooney. You realize that makes it worse. I can handle a little flirting. This is blatant sexual advances. I cannot handle that from you." Mooney, "From me specifically?" Padfoot, "From you, very specifically. You should already know why." Mooney, "Indulge me." Padfoot, "Because I am shamefully attracted to you." Mooney, "You don't even know what I look like." Padfoot, "Okay, first of all, looks aren't everything. Secondly, I've heard your singing voice. Case closed. Just kidding, case reopened because thirdly, I've watched you play bass." Mooney, "Is the way I play bass attractive?" Padfoot, "That's a joke, right? In general, bassists just are attractive. Law of nature." Mooney, "I need specific examples, other than me, I guess." Padfoot, "I'll give you my favorite example. Kenny Vasoli, the starting line." Mooney, "But he's got that voice." Padfoot, "Excuse me, sir. Do you hear yourself when you sing? Your voice does things to me. Not to mention, the way you play basses, it's downright sexual." Mooney, "Oh, and you're, into that? Watching me play bass, I mean." Padfoot, "Fuck yes." Mooney, "Oh my god, this is awful." Padfoot, "If you're uncomfortable with this, we can stop." Mooney, "No, fuck. The problem is, I don't want to stop, but I'm leading you on, and it leads nowhere." Padfoot, "I'm okay with fruitlessly pining over you for now. At some point, you'll be sick of me anyway, and I'll never get over you and die alone. It'll be fine." Mooney, "I can't imagine ever getting sick of you, but if you're okay with this being whatever the fuck it is, then so am I." Before Sirius could reply, Father Lupin emerged from a door at the side of the pulpit, and as much as Sirius wanted to childishly snicker at the ostentatious vestments he had to wear to say Mass, he couldn't, mostly because he was too busy swallowing the massive lump in his throat at the way the cream-colored collar highlighted the father's dark copper skin. and how the emerald and gold satin of the robe influenced the deep amber of his eyes and accentuated the gold in those round, quirky frames that sat just atop his prominent cheekbones. In the careless way his wavy, uneven hair was swept all to one side. As Father Lupin looked up and found Sirius's eyes in the crowd, Lupin's expression softened. "Fuck," Sirius whispered helplessly to himself, preceding a deep breath. When he had semi-successfully composed himself, he moved into the pew, pushing past his grumbling cousins to throw himself loudly into the cushioned wooden bench next to his mother, who shot him an angry look. "Not surprised you're late," she muttered under her breath, keeping her eyes forward. "But I foolishly hoped you would have worn something a little nicer than that." And maybe it had a little more to do with the fact that Father Lupin was speaking, and Sirius wasn't able to hear what he was saying over the petty hissing of his mother's comments, but he wasn't in the mood to listen to her complain. "I'm not here for you," Sirius growled through clenched teeth, locking eyes with Father Lupin for a moment. "I'm just making an appearance so you won't throw out any of my brother's belongings." "I don't see why it should matter to you. Nothing in that room is yours," Walburga snapped in reply, as Sirius squirmed in his uncomfortable seat, trying not to let his anger overwhelm him. "More mine than yours," he said, tightening his jaw. The only cousin he didn't hate, Andromeda, leaned over the other two, the obnoxious ones, Bellatrix and Narcissa, to whisper threateningly. "Sirius, save it for after the service," she advised, with a pointed glare. He sighed and nodded. But apparently his mother wasn't finished. "I don't know why you care about the rubbish that's in that room," she said, haughty and arrogant. "You didn't care about it when you abandoned him." In his bitterness, Sirius put his foot down to turn to face his mother, the sound of it echoing in the otherwise silence of the church. Even Father Lupin stopped speaking for a moment with a glance of concern. "I didn't abandon him. I begged him to come with me." He spoke through his teeth, clamped tight with rage. "How dare you put that guilt on me when you were the one making his life unlivable?" "Your father," she emphasized, growing flushed with irritation. "Don't you blame this on him now that he's dead," Sirius barked, getting shushed by a few parishioners in the surrounding pews. "You were right there with him. You were the one who led Reg to cut himself every time his grades weren't perfect. You were the one who encouraged him to starve to death when you told him he didn't get that role in the school play because he was too pudgy." "He made those choices himself," she hissed, vein bulging at her temple. And Sirius thought, if he were lucky, maybe he could induce another stress-related cardiac event in the last of his progenitors. "He was a child, and you ruined his life," Sirius seethed, breath searing on his tongue. With a quick snap of her head and wild dart of her beady eyes, Walburga faced him, unwilling to lose a fight. "Yet he chose to stay with me rather than live one day out there with you," she said, the silver in her eyes, so much like Sirius's own, looking more sinister than it ever had. "Because you are abhorrently unlovable, Sirius." The broken breath moved from Sirius's lungs before he could close his lips to keep it in, and his mother looked victorious by his devastation. "Take whatever you want from Regulus's room," she continued, reveling in her triumph by salting the wound. "That is, if you want to live next to a constant reminder of the brother who never loved you because of your immense failure as a human being." Still stunting his breath to keep it from making him appear weak, he bit down hard onto the inside of his lip to keep it from trembling. The blood tasted like warm metal. He said nothing. When he stood, the church fell silent again, but he made not a sound as he stepped out into the center aisle and moved towards the swinging doors in the back that led to the garden. As the doors swung closed behind him, he never heard the sound of Father Lupin's voice resume from the pulpit. There was a lit cigarette between his teeth before he even made it outside. He thought God might forgive him, just this once. "James, for the love of God, I'm fine. And I meant it the first 57 times I said it," Sirius said into the phone, trying hard not to sigh again because he didn't want James to worry, even more, which would ultimately result in James making the 2-hour drive in a fury so that he could slap Sirius's mother across the face. As much as Sirius would love to watch that happen, it really wouldn't undo the damage of what she had said. It wouldn't make Sirius feel any less like crying. It wouldn't make it any less true. He was on his 11th cigarette since stepping out into the garden. If he hadn't made plans to devise a rough draft of the eulogy with Father Lupin, he would have driven to his mother's house, packed up all of Regulus's things that he could fit into his car, and gone home immediately. Well, he'd already done the first part of that. The back of his car was crammed with stuff, but he hadn't gone home. His hands were still shaking, even after the first big drag on cigarette number 11. Of course, he'd had nothing else to do since storming out of the church, but sit on this little rickety bench along the brick of the church and obsess over what his mother had said to him. Well, besides stealing most of Regulus's stuff and taking a detour to flick spent cigarette ash on his mother's silk pillowcase, even hope for entertainment from Mooney had flitted to dust. As of about an hour ago, Mooney was MIA. It could have been the way Sirius had desperately begged for his attention. That was probably a bit off-putting. They weren't even anything. But Sirius had typed out that frantic, reckless message, "I need a distraction, Mooney. Flirt with me some more," and hit send before he could consider the implications. It wouldn't surprise Sirius if he'd scared Mooney off, entirely with his clinginess. "Don't ask me why I'm helping with the eulogy, okay? I just am," Sirius said with a huff, knowing that James would give him endless shit for the vaguely trying to seduce a fucking priest. "Anyway, I'll bullshit my way through it and be home before dark. It probably goes without saying, but..." He trailed off, and James knew immediately what he wanted to ask before he asked it, and told Sirius in a single breath that when he said, "come home," what he really meant was to come to his and Lily's and stay the night. James always seemed to know when Sirius didn't need to be alone. "Thank you," he said softly into the line. He didn't ask how the lovemaking had gone the night before. Just then, he didn't really want to talk about the creation of a new family when his own was such a shit show. Maybe that made him a little selfish. At the very moment that he disconnected the call, his mobile vibrated in his hand again. While he was relieved to see that it was Mooney, he was slightly nervous about what his response would be. "Mooney. Fuck. I got caught up in something. Is everything okay? What kind of distraction are we talking here? I can get really filthy if that's what you're looking for." Padfoot. "Damn, you get right to business. Wow. Won't date me, but not against sexting. Good to know. Very good to know." Mooney. "I was afraid that might be too heavy for you, but since you were asking for a distraction, I thought you might need a big one." Padfoot. "Was that a euphemism?" Mooney. "I feel like I should say no." Padfoot. "I had no idea what I was getting into here. A horny bass player with an enormous cock. Who am I not allowed to see or date? This is a nightmare, honestly." Mooney. "At least you're well distracted now." Padfoot. "Jesus, I'll say. For fuck's sake. I'm probably blushing. God." Mooney. "Just for clarity's sake, you said enormous. And you're just assuming I'm horny because I offered to be filthy." Padfoot. "For clarity's sake, are you horny right now?" Mooney. "I mean, we're discussing my cock, so, yeah, a little." Padfoot. "Son of a bitch. Honestly, you have shit timing. I'm literally at church." Mooney. "Oh shit. Should I be sorry for offering to get you off in church? I'm kinda not." Faintly, Sirius could hear music coming from inside the church, and he wondered if the service had ended. He had a strange, conflicting moment of guilt about his near-filthy text conversation with his punk bass player, not boyfriend, when Father Lupin was about to come out with his clerical collar around his throat. In fact, talking to them both, feeling about them both in a similar way, made him feel odd. Mooney. "Wait, then why do you need a distraction? Also, for future reference, that request did sound a little horny. I need a distraction. Flirt with me. Not entirely my fault that we went there." Padfoot. "All right, fine. I concede fault on that. And I'm not at church out of my own desire to be here. Well, that part is sort of complicated at this point. I'm here because of my mother. Mooney. Right. Marlene mentioned something about that. That's how our mobiles got swapped? 'Cause your mother pissed you off? And you nearly broke your screen on my merch table. Does this have to do with your black eye? How was that, by the way? I wanted to ask, but I didn't really want to pry. Padfoot. Yeah, so I don't have time to unpack my family baggage. At least not like right this moment, because I'm about to meet with this priest. He's hot, by the way. Just in case you wanted to be jealous. Also, my eye is fine. Thank you for caring. Mooney. I'm glad your eye is all right. And I'm not going to lie, I am a little bit jealous right now. Are you going to seduce the priest? Padfoot. Oh, I already tried. He's not having it. Mooney. Why do people have a priest kink? I've never understood that. Padfoot. If you saw this man in the collar, you would. Mooney. Damn, describe him to me. Padfoot. Curly, sort of choppy black hair. Copper skin tone like you, except without, the massive amount of tattoos. Slender sort of build, I guess. Again, a bit like you. Sort of lanky. Mooney. Is lanky a compliment? Padfoot. For you it is, yes. And for the priest. Got this salt and pepper thing going on with his hair. And in his beard. And in his eyebrows. Jesus. Wears the most adorable glasses. Oh, and gold eyes. Mooney. I think that's called hazel. Padfoot. No. Hazel has a bit of green. My best mate's eyes are hazel. This is just gold. Like light brown, but yellow? Mooney. All right, I'm officially jealous. You're practically swooning. Padfoot. If you'd let me date you, this would have happened. I might fall in love with this priest. Mooney. Pretty sure a priest isn't allowed to date either. Hang on, did you fall for 2 blokes you can't date? Padfoot. Why is my life like this? Mooney. I'm at least open to sexting. Bet the priest doesn't tell you that. Speak of which, you busy later? Text me when you get done with confession, and I can distract you. Padfoot. Fuck, you make me want to bail on the priest. Mooney. Keep your date with the priest. I'll be here when you're good and frustrated. Just as Sirius let his mouth fall open, cigarette dangling heedlessly from his loose lips, the back door of the church opened, and Father Lupin moved out. There was a quick glance of initial surprise at the cigarette between Sirius's open lips, moving into a curious peer at the screen of Sirius's phone. Are you all right? Father Lupin asked, voice soft. He settled down next to Sirius on the bench, and Sirius immediately locked his mobile screen so Lupin wouldn't see Sirius's conversation about him. It's fine, Sirius said, cigarette bobbing between his teeth as he spoke, surprised at how blatantly Father Lupin's attention was drawn to his mouth. We already know I don't get along with my mother. Or your father, Lupin smirked. Listen, I hate that you have to keep another secret from me, but, His eyes flitted down to Sirius's mouth again, and this time he licked his lips. Slowly. Got another one of those? A smile of bewilderment moved across Sirius's face as he patted his jacket pocket. Be my guest, Father, he said, handing his half-empty pack and his lighter to Lupin. His surprise was less over the smoking. Sirius was already privy to that secret anyway, and more over the fact that this priest seemed oddly comfortable in his presence, enough to share a cigarette with him. I thought you didn't like to call me father, he mused, tapping the pack to coax a single cigarette from the box and wrapping his lips around it before slipping it from the package. You're welcome to keep guessing my first name, but I guarantee you'll never get it right. His words began to mumble from his lips' accommodation of the paper between them, and Sirius found himself absolutely entranced by it. Now, I know it's an unusual name, so that narrows it down quite a bit. Gwillem, Sirius said with a small laugh, shifting his knee to knock it softly, playfully, against Father Lupin's leg. Just because a name is Welsh doesn't mean it's unusual, Lupin laughed, lips still pursed together from where he was lighting the cigarette between them. When it was lit, he took in a profoundly deep breath, gifting Sirius with the changes it left in the angle of his sharply defined throat, though most of it was obscured by his high collar, a sliver of white extending out past the surrounding black. "Whatever you say, Tobias." As Lupin exhaled, Sirius tried desperately to ignore the soft, pleasured moan he released with the smoke and the way he tilted his head back in uninterrupted bliss. "Do you want to talk about it?" Lupin asked delicately, his voice somehow sounding so much deeper, so much rougher, so much more raw after only a single drag. His head was still leaned back. He had pried a single eye open to look over in Sirius's direction. Sirius was having a hard time looking back. "What, my mother?" Sirius laughed nervously. He really didn't like discussing his family. He barely talked about it with James. What is there to say? It's not like anything she hasn't said to me before. At first, Lupin seemed to watch him, almost warily, uncertainly, and he habitually adjusted his round frames, their golden rims catching the light from the sun. With a shake of his head, Sirius realized Lupin had been arguing with himself about something, and he'd come to a resolution of that argument. "Fuck it," he finally said. Sirius took in a sharp breath. "This calls for alcohol," he said as he stood, reaching for Sirius's hand. There was a breath of hesitation, but ultimately Sirius took it, and his hand was so soft, so warm. The way he squeezed Sirius's fingers was so reassuring and so comforting and so delicate. As Sirius stood, he laughed. "Are we about to steal communion wine, Father?" Almost in synchrony, they tossed their half-smoked cigarettes onto the pavement that led around the church, and Sirius used the toe of his boot to stamp them both out. After peeking through the back door to make sure they wouldn't be found out, Father Lupin pulled Sirius down the hall. And Sirius specifically took notice of the way Lupin had furtively nodded his fingers into Sirius's own. Once they made it to the end of the hallway, they descended the stairs that Sirius had come across earlier that morning, and without letting Sirius's fingers slip from his, Father Lupin took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. "Please, I've got better booze than that," Lupin said with a haughty huff as he pushed open the door and held it for Sirius to move through. Inside, it looked like a small studio flat. An inviting, dark blue sofa sat in the front of a short coffee table, the uneven edge of which looked like it had been sliced directly from a tree. In the opposite corner, a small but workable kitchen, a miniature island with a granite countertop in the center of the open space. On the only remaining wall was an oak door with a golden knob, the same color as Lupin's glasses, and Sirius could only assume it led to his bedroom. Father Lupin motioned to the sofa as he reached for the kitchen cabinets. "You look like you drank whiskey." "Fuck yes, I do," Sirius practically growled. He'd been itching for a drink all damn day. There was a clipped laugh from Lupin's lips, as if he knew he shouldn't laugh at Sirius's desperation for liquor. "Well, if you don't want to talk about it, at least we can drink about it," Lupin said with a cautious glance in Sirius's direction, as Sirius finally decided to let himself relax, slinking down into the sofa. "It just pisses me off that much more to say it out loud," Sirius said behind a false bravado. And it wasn't untrue, but only half the truth. The deeper truth was that Sirius didn't want to admit what his mother had said to him out loud because he wasn't sure how he would react to hearing himself say it. "I'm happy drinking either way," Father Lupin said with a glance over his shoulder, as if worried the Pope himself was standing just behind him. Sirius couldn't help but smirk at the playful worry in Lupin's expression, at the way his torso twisted as he tried to converse with Sirius with his back still turned. "But just in case you were worried about it, I'm obligated to keep whatever you tell me just between us." Sirius let out a soft laugh. "Even if it's not in your funny little booth?" With a smile, Lupin turned with 2 tumblers splashed with whiskey, both glasses held entirely within the span of a single hand, the neck of the whiskey bottle in the other. He held out his hand for Sirius to take one of the glasses, and he set the half-empty bottle onto the odd-shaped coffee table, settling into the opposite corner of the sofa and crossing one leg over the other, ankle over knee. Holding the rim of the glass, he upended the whole thing into his throat without so much as a wince and set the empty glass delicately onto the table. "Even if it's not in the booth," he confirmed with a solemn sort of nod, closing his eyes in some show of sincerity. Sirius playfully narrowed his eyes in the father's direction, watching him in suspicion. "How do I know you're not a spy for my mother?" he said under a tight laugh. And Lupin must have heard it for what it was, because Sirius had barely finished speaking before Lupin replied. "Because I hate your mother." He put on a wide smile to cover up the animosity in his expression, but Sirius could see it in the dull of his golden eyes, darkening to something that looked like dry resin. "Looks like we have a lot in common, Marcus." Sirius smiled, lifting his glass to symbolically toast to their shared hatred of Walburga Black, and he emptied the contents quickly, savoring the sting it left. "Your guesses are getting worse." He used his middle finger to push his glasses up his nose. "Well, if you gave me a better hint, maybe I'd be getting warmer," Sirius replied, leaning closer and letting his head fall backwards onto the back cushions of the sofa. With a charged glance in Sirius's direction, Lupin shifted to grab the whiskey bottle and his glass, and he refilled both, heavy-handed. To Sirius's surprise, Father Lupin replied cryptically with mythology, alongside a raised brow and a smile that looked far too mischievous and wild to belong to the face of a Catholic priest. "Greek mythology?" Sirius tried to clarify, but Lupin just tilted his head. "You've reached your maximum number of hints, I'm afraid." "Damn you," Sirius grinned, taking an easier sip from his refilled tumbler. "You're welcome to come up with a nickname for me, if you're tired of guessing," Lupin suggested with a strange smirk in the corner of his lips, as if he'd won the game. And it reminded Sirius of Mooney, which left him with a slight surge of guilt. Despite that he and Mooney were not dating, despite that he and Mooney couldn't date, despite that Mooney knew about the mysterious priest. But it was a strange guilt, like feeling guilty for something he'd done in a dream, because talking to Father Lupin was a lot like talking to Mooney, so much so that Sirius began to forget which one was intentionally flirting with him and which one had been accidentally flirting with him. Their personalities were so similar that he was beginning to get one confused for the other, and maybe that's where the guilt was developing. "You know," Sirius said, trying to decide how much he wanted to say about this, but wanting to say it nonetheless. "You're the second person I've met this week who won't tell me their first name." There was a quiet smile on Lupin's face. "Is that so?" he asked, smile only growing. "At least I have a legitimate excuse for maintaining a certain level of anonymity." He gestured to his throat, or at least Sirius's gaze went to his throat, wishing he could see the sharp curve of his Adam's apple without a clerical collar in the way. "Or it's because I'm intimidated by the most adorable first name in history." "Did you just admit, out loud, that you think I'm adorable?" Sirius bit his lip to keep from smiling. "Your name," Lupin clarified, that deep rose blush moving through his cheeks, so different from the bright red blush he found in James's son's kissed skin when Lily winked at him from stage, or the sharp pink of Lily's freckled skin when she'd been drumming her arse off for the last 2 hours. "I said your name was adorable, and that is in no way an admission of anything more." His ears were red too. "I think you're adorable too, Father." "Now you're just calling me Father to belittle me." "Well, what the hell else am I supposed to call you?" "What do you call your other friends with no name?" Lupin asked, taking a much smaller sip from his whiskey glass, but keeping his very pointed, gilded gaze on Sirius from over the tops of his glasses. "Mooney," Sirius answered honestly, and he must have spoken it a little breathily, a little dreamily, because Father Lupin took in a sharp, quiet breath, covering it by adjusting his glasses again. "Why Mooney?" he asked, clearing his throat to level his voice. "I just asked him what object was on his left, and he was outside, so the moon," Sirius said with a fond smile, but he shrugged it away. "I guess I could have named him something a little more meaningful, but I haven't gotten to know him that well yet." Lupin shook his head, a quiet smile on his lips. "No, you should keep that one." He nodded, watching Sirius closely again. "It's adorable." Sirius let out a loud laugh. "You keep throwing that word around, Father. It's cute." With a playful roll of his eyes, Lupin stretched out a bit on the sofa, propping his feet onto the wood-sliced coffee table. So, how did you meet this guy? This Mooney? He asked, as he snuggled down into the back cushions of the sofa, leaning his head back. Sirius found himself doing the same, working in closer. At a show. He plays bass for, this band, actually, he said with a laugh, pinching the shoulder seams of his t-shirt and stretching it out to display the Hollyhead logo. Curiously, Father Lupin leaned in toward Sirius's chest to see it more clearly, and Sirius caught himself holding his breath. Are they any good? Lupin asked, still leaning in, glancing from Sirius's shirt up to Sirius's face, over the tops of his rounded lenses. Immediately, Sirius forgot propriety and let out a sigh. They're incredible, he said under a half moan, letting his hand drag down his chest as he recalled the growl in Mooney's voice as he sang the lyric, "Someone save me, someone save me." So, did you interview him, Mr. Editor-in-Chief? Father Lupin remarked, tongue-in-cheek. No, Sirius replied with sass in his throat. We got our phones mixed up, actually. How the fuck does that happen? Lupin mumbled onto the lip of his whiskey glass before taking another long sip, and Sirius took the time to appreciate all the movement in his throat as he swallowed. With a heavy sigh, Sirius downed the rest of his liquor, too. Another thing I can blame on my mother. Probably the only positive influence she has ever had on my life, and it was by pure accident. What happened? Father Lupin asked, a softness in his voice that hadn't been there before. And maybe it was the way he asked it, or it was the whiskey that dulled his apprehension, or maybe it was because Lupin inched over a bit closer on the sofa. Whatever it was, Sirius said more than he intended. She threatened me into coming to Mass this morning. Sirius reached over to grab the bottle of whiskey on the table, sloshing a more than generous refill into his glass. To his surprise, Father Lupin had held his glass up, so Sirius poured him another, too. Then, I do exactly what she asks, and she thanks me by telling me that I am abhorrently unlovable. Said those exact words to me. My own mother. After a momentary tightening of his teeth, Sirius opened his mouth wide and threw more liquor into it. You're far from unlovable, Sirius. Father Lupin tried to reassure him, but Sirius shook his head with a bitter laugh, wrinkling his nose in an effort to stave off any unintended tears that might appear. I appreciate the sentiment, but if you knew me, you wouldn't say that, Sirius said with a forceful exhale, as if he could blow all the guilt and resentment out through his lungs. Before Sirius could try to convince himself to change the subject as he poured another glass, Father Lupin responded swiftly. Then let me get to know you, so you'll believe me the next time I say it, he said under a confident smirk that caught Sirius off guard. Without another word, he emptied his glass, smirking. If you weren't flirting with me before, you sure as hell are now, Sirius observed with an hesitant smile, wondering why the way Lupin spoke, his choice of words seemed so strangely familiar. Say what you want, Lupin shrugged, grabbing the whiskey bottle as he continued. And I don't care if she's your mother. I don't care if she's a member of my congregation. She's a total fucking bitch. Jesus, Lupin, Sirius sputtered out a laugh, nearly spitting whiskey all over the priest. God, I hate that, Father Lupin suddenly groaned, leaving Sirius to raise a single brow. I don't want you to call me father, and I don't want you to call me by my last name. It sounds so impersonal. Sorry, wasn't that kind of the point? Sirius's laugh grew and strengthened, maintaining a certain level of anonymity in all that rot. With another low growl of frustration, Lupin let his head roll back onto the sofa cushion, with the arch in Sirius's brow rose even higher with the breath in his chest. Keep guessing. That was fun, he said with a puckish grin, pouring his third glass of whiskey. Give me another hint and we've got a deal. At first, the father narrowed his eyes in Sirius's direction, and Sirius thought he wasn't going to accept the terms of the new deal, until he spoke. Italy, he stated simply, seeming to enjoy watching Sirius as Sirius watched him. Damiano, Sirius guessed with blind confidence, and Father Lupin rolled his eyes heavily, struggling to subdue the laughter that was obviously forming on his tightly pursed lips. I'm not Italian, you numpty, Father Lupin said, a fragment of that laugh slipping across his tongue, clipped by his teeth. My family is from Bengaluru, in India. Well, on my father's side, anyway. All right, so you're half Italian. On your mother's side. Sirius playfully shrugged with a comical smirk, really trying to get him to laugh again, because the sound of it was like an unfinished symphony. Right. I got this noticeable Irish lilt from my Italian heritage. Lupin shot back with a smile. It's actually very subtle, Sirius argued, for no other reason than to keep the banter going, or maybe to distract himself from the fact that he'd been smitten with the slight, delicate trace of that accent in the breathy way Father Lupin softened the T at the end of many of his words against the more hardened R in the back of his throat. Wait, I missed most of the sermon. Say the word Jesus. I absolutely will not, he grinned, getting visibly drawn into Sirius's antics. I mean it. Your accent is so soft, Sirius said, and he must have accentuated that word a little bit more heavily than he meant to, because Lupin raised his brow a bit. Did you live in Ireland long? It felt like a long time. His eyebrows furrowed for a minute, as if he were arguing with himself about how much of his heritage he wanted to reveal. My parents lived in Bristol until... He stopped, reaching up to pull his hand along the back of his neck before starting over. My grandfather, on my mother's side, took me in right after I turned 11. I lived with him in Baltinglass until I went away to uni. He said, pausing to swallow deeply, and Sirius began to realize, with a sharp pain, that he wasn't the only one with significant family trauma, which is why I was raised Roman Catholic instead of Hindu. At first, Sirius opened his mouth to respond, not sure what he intended to say, but knowing he needed to say something, some show of solidarity. Instead, he said, Roman? In a soft, uncertain tone. Roman? Father Lupin asked, glancing at him curiously, uncertain smile just beginning to return. That's my guess. Your name is Roman. In his surprise, the father's mouth fell open, and for just a moment, Sirius thought, by some miracle, he'd guessed right, especially as Lupin blinked mutely at him for several more seconds, his unruly eyebrows furrowing and unfurrowing the whole time. That is actually a really good guess. You have no idea how strangely close that is, he said with a laugh of disbelief, sitting up to grab the whiskey again, this time taking a very long, very heavy, very concerning swill straight from the bottle. With wide eyes, Sirius watched in both awe and distress. I take it you don't really want to talk about your family anymore, Sirius suggested as Lupin pulled his lips from the bottle with a very loud pop, dragging his hand across the saturated mouth. No, he said strongly, before adding, no more than you do. In that show of solidarity he'd been trying to come up with, Sirius wiped the bottle from Lupin and took a very long and very concerning shot of his own, emptying the bottle that had been nearly full a conversation ago. Can we get super fucking drunk instead? He asked, licking his lips. Under a deep breath and careful calculation in his darkened amber eyes, the man in the collar pushed both hands through his hair. Fuck it, he said again, just as he'd said on the bench outside. Let's get super fucking drunk. Lead the way, Father. Sirius grinned as Lupin got up and made his way into the kitchen to rummage through his cabinets for more alcohol. He was halfway there when he stopped. If we're about to get drunk together, you absolutely cannot keep calling me Father, he said, turning to look at Sirius with a specific expression that Sirius had no way of interpreting. You said Roman was close. Is it close enough? Sirius asked. That specific, untranslatable expression morphed into something that Sirius had seen earlier, the same peculiar grin that had been on Lupin's face when he had said the words, I don't even know who you are, as if it wasn't true. It's not as cute as Mooney, but I'll take it, he said quietly, the grin overpowering his face so intensely that he turned back to the kitchen in some apparent effort to hide it. But it was too late. That grin had already spread to Sirius's face, and he was fairly sure it was only going to keep spreading.